The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds at Fort Bragg as Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus with 49 other recruits. At barely 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighing no more than 120 pounds, she looked like she had wandered into the wrong place. The other recruits towered over her, their muscles already defined from years of preparation for this moment. Sergeant Miller, a mountain of a man with 20 years of military experience, scanned the group with sharp eyes. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than the others, and she could see the doubt written across his weathered face. She had seen that look before. In high school when she tried out for the wrestling team, in college when she joined the ROTC program, and even from her own family when she announced her intention to pursue Special Forces training. "Listen up, recruits," Sergeant Miller's voice boomed across the assembly area. "For the next 12 weeks, this place will test every fiber of your being. Some of you think you know what tough means. You're about to learn you were wrong." Sarah stood at attention, her back straight and eyes forward, but she could feel the sideways glances from her fellow recruits. She had heard the whispers on the bus, comments about how the military was going soft by lowering standards, assumptions that she was only there to fill some kind of quota. The doubt in their voices stung more than she cared to admit, but it also fueled something deep inside her. The first day began with basic physical assessments: push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and a 2-mile run. Sarah had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, waking up at 4 in the morning to train before her college classes, spending weekends hiking with a weighted backpack, and learning everything she could about military tactics and strategy. When it came time for push-ups, Sarah dropped down beside Jackson, a former college football player who looked like he could bench press a small car. As Sergeant Miller called out the cadence, Sarah kept pace, her form perfect despite her smaller frame. By the time they reached 50 push-ups, several of the larger recruits were struggling, their arms shaking with effort. Sarah continued, steady and controlled. "Interesting," Sergeant Miller muttered, making a note on his clipboard. The pull-up test was where most people expected Sarah to fail. The bar hung 10 feet high, and she had to jump to reach it. As she gripped the cold metal, she could hear someone behind her whisper, "This should be good for a laugh." Sarah pulled herself up once, twice, 3 times. Her shoulders burned, but she had trained for this. She thought about her grandfather, who had served in Vietnam and taught her that strength wasn't about size, it was about will. She thought about every person who had told her she wasn't cut out for this life. By the time Sergeant Miller called time, Sarah had completed 15 perfect pull-ups. The whispers stopped. During the 2-mile run, Sarah found her rhythm quickly. Running had always been her strength. While some of the bigger recruits struggled with their pace, weighed down by their own muscle mass, Sarah moved like water, smooth and efficient. She finished 3rd overall, behind 2 distance runners who had prepared specifically for endurance events. As the day progressed, the challenges intensified. They moved to obstacle courses, rope climbing, and tactical exercises. Each time, Sarah approached the task methodically, using technique and intelligence where others relied purely on brute force. During rope climbing, while Jackson struggled to haul his massive frame up the 30-foot rope, Sarah used a technique called the J-hook that she had learned from watching rock climbing videos. She moved up the rope quickly and efficiently, reaching the top while others were still halfway up. Sergeant Miller watched with growing interest. He had seen thousands of recruits come through this program, and he knew that the ones who succeeded weren't always the biggest or the strongest. They were the ones who were smart, adaptable, and absolutely determined to prove themselves. That evening, as the recruits sat exhausted in the mess hall, the atmosphere around Sarah began to shift. Rodriguez, a former Marine who had joined the Army to try for Special Forces, sat down across from her. "Where did you learn to climb rope like that?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Sarah looked up from her meal. "YouTube," she said simply, then smiled. "And about 1,000 hours of practice in my college gym." Rodriguez laughed. "YouTube? Seriously? I studied everything I could find about military training, watched videos, read manuals, talked to veterans. I knew I'd have to work twice as hard to prove I belonged here." She paused, then added, "I'm still working twice as hard." Thompson, who had been one of the loudest skeptics on the bus, overheard the conversation. "I got to admit, you surprised me today. Most people your size would have washed out by lunch." Sarah looked at him directly. Most people your size did wash out by lunch. It was true. 2 of the larger recruits had already been sent home after failing the basic fitness requirements. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah continued to prove herself in ways that surprised everyone, including her instructors. During navigation exercises in the dense forests surrounding the base, while others got lost despite their GPS devices, Sarah found her way using basic compass and map reading skills her grandfather had taught her during childhood camping trips. When they moved to weapons training, Sarah's steady hands and patient practice paid off. She had spent months at civilian shooting ranges, learning proper stance, breathing, and trigger control. Her first day on the rifle range, she outshot half the men in her unit, including several who had grown up hunting. But it was during a particularly challenging night exercise that Sarah truly began to earn respect from her fellow recruits. The task was simple in concept but brutal in execution. Teams of 5 had to navigate 3 miles through rough terrain in complete darkness, carrying a 100-pound pack between them, without using any artificial light. Sarah's team included Jackson, Thompson, Rodriguez, and Davis, 4 men who each outweighed her by at least 60 pounds. When they divided up the gear, the others instinctively assumed they would carry the heavy pack while Sarah handled lighter equipment. "I can take my share," Sarah said quietly. Thompson shook his head. "Look, no offense, but we need to get through this. Let us handle the heavy stuff." Sarah stood her ground. "We're a team. That means everyone contributes equally." The compromise they reached was that everyone would take turns with the pack, switching every quarter mile. Sarah insisted on going first, strapping the heavy load to her small frame and setting off into the darkness. The terrain was brutal: rocky hills, thick underbrush, and hidden streams that could turn an ankle or soak gear. Sarah moved carefully but steadily, using skills she had learned not just in training but from years of backpacking with her family. She knew how to distribute weight, how to navigate by feel and sound when visibility was zero, and how to pace herself for long distances. When her quarter mile was up, she handed the pack to Jackson, who immediately understood that she hadn't just been carrying dead weight. She had been navigating for the entire team, leading them along the most efficient route while managing the heavy load. "How did you know which way to go?" Jackson asked as they continued through the darkness. "Wind direction, ground slope, sound of traffic from the highway," Sarah replied. "My grandfather taught me that the landscape always tells you where you are if you know how to listen." By the time they reached the halfway point, Sarah had taken 2 more turns with the pack, and each time she had guided the team successfully through terrain that had stopped other groups. When they finally reached the finish line, first among all the teams, Sergeant Miller was waiting with a flashlight and his ever-present clipboard. "Outstanding work," he said, making notes. "Martinez, front and center." Sarah stepped forward, unsure if she was in trouble or being praised. "That was some of the finest land navigation I've seen from a recruit," Sergeant Miller said. "How long have you been training for this?" "All my life, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "Just didn't know it at the time." As they walked back toward the barracks, Thompson fell into step beside her. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I made assumptions about what you could do based on how you look." "That was wrong," Sarah nodded. "We all make assumptions. The difference is being willing to change them when we learn new information." That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The doubting looks had been replaced by nods of acknowledgement. The whispered comments about quotas and lowered standards had stopped entirely. She had proven that strength came in many forms, and that determination could make up for any perceived physical disadvantage. But she also knew this was just the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, and she would need every ounce of that determination to make it through what was coming next. The 6th week of training brought new challenges that separated the dedicated from the merely hopeful. Sarah watched as 3 more recruits packed their bags, unable to handle the mental pressure that came with advanced tactical training. The physical demands had been intense, but now they were moving into psychological warfare, strategy, and leadership exercises that tested not just what recruits could do, but how they thought under extreme pressure. Sergeant Miller stood before the remaining 31 recruits, his expression more serious than usual. Behind him, a large map covered in red and blue markers showed a complex tactical scenario. "Today, we begin war games," he announced. "You'll be divided into 2 teams. Each team must complete a series of objectives while preventing the other team from completing theirs. This isn't about individual performance anymore. This is about leadership, strategy, and making decisions when lives depend on it." Sarah found herself assigned to the blue team, along with Jackson, Rodriguez, and 12 other recruits. The red team included Thompson and Davis, along with some of the strongest remaining candidates. Each team was given identical resources: maps, communication equipment, simulated weapons, and a list of 3 objectives they needed to complete within 24 hours. The blue team gathered around their equipment to develop strategy. Martinez, a former Army Ranger who had joined to try for Special Forces, immediately stepped forward to take charge. "All right. Here's what we're going to do," Martinez began, spreading out the map. "We hit the first objective hard and fast, then move to the second one before they know what's happening." Sarah studied the map while Martinez outlined his plan. Something didn't feel right about his approach. The objectives were spread across difficult terrain, and Martinez's strategy seemed to ignore several tactical advantages the red team could exploit. "What if we approach this differently?" Sarah suggested quietly. Martinez looked annoyed. "What do you mean?" Sarah pointed to the map. "If we follow this route, we're exposed on this ridgeline for almost 2 miles. The red team can see us coming from 3 different vantage points. But if we take this longer path through the valley, we can approach the first objective from the north, where they won't expect us. That adds 3 hours to our timeline," Martinez objected. "We don't have time for the scenic route." "Oh," Rodriguez looked between the 2 plans. "Actually, Sarah might have a point. Look at this terrain here. If the red team sets up defensive positions on this hill, Martinez's plan puts us in a kill zone." Quote, "I've been doing this longer than both of you combined," Martinez snapped. "We're going with my plan." Sarah didn't argue further, but she caught Jackson's eye. He gave her a small nod. He had seen the same tactical problems she had identified. The exercise began at dawn. Martinez led the blue team along his chosen route, moving quickly across open ground toward the first objective. Sarah stayed alert, scanning the terrain ahead for any signs of the opposing force. They were halfway across the exposed ridge when Rodriguez's radio crackled. "Contact front," he whispered urgently. "Red team, 11 o'clock. Approximately 400 meters. Martinez froze, suddenly realizing they were exactly where Sarah had predicted they would be vulnerable. The red team had positioned themselves perfectly to observe the blue team's approach, and now they were trapped in the open with no cover. "What do we do?" whispered Chen, one of the younger recruits. Martinez looked around desperately, but the terrain offered no easy solutions. They could retreat, losing valuable time and giving away their presence, or continue forward into what was clearly a trap. Sarah spoke quietly into her radio. "Jackson, Rodriguez, you see that drainage ditch to our right? If we low crawl about 50 meters, we can get into that ravine and circle around behind their position." "That's not part of the plan," Martinez objected. "The plan just got us pinned down in the open," Sarah replied calmly. "We adapt, or we fail." Jackson made the decision for everyone. "Sarah's right. Martinez, you and half the team create a distraction here. Sarah, take the rest of us around the flank." It wasn't a mutiny, but it was a clear shift in leadership dynamics. Martinez wasn't happy, but he couldn't argue with the tactical logic. Sarah led Jackson, Rodriguez, Chen, and 2 others in a careful crawl toward the drainage ditch. The movement was slow and uncomfortable, requiring them to stay flat against the ground while carrying their gear. But it kept them hidden from the red team's observation. Once they reached the ravine, Sarah quickly assessed their new position. The depression in the ground connected to a series of rock formations that would provide concealment all the way to the red team's flank. Rodriguez, you and Johnson circle left. When you're in position, Jackson and I will move right. Chen, you stay here and coordinate with Martinez's group. When we're all set, we hit them from 3 directions at once. You sure about this? Jackson asked. Sarah smiled grimly. My grandfather always said that when you can't go through something, you go around it. When you can't go around it, you go over it. When you can't go over it, you dig under it. We're going around. The flanking maneuver took 40 minutes to execute, but it worked perfectly. While Martinez's group maintained the red team's attention from the front, Sarah's flanking teams moved into position undetected. When they finally attacked, the red team found themselves surrounded and quickly overwhelmed. Blue team, first objective secured, Sarah reported into her radio. Sergeant Miller's voice crackled back over the command frequency. Outstanding execution, blue team. Red team, you've just learned a valuable lesson about terrain awareness. The success of the first objective changed the entire dynamic of the blue team. When they gathered to plan their approach to the second objective, Martinez no longer automatically assumed leadership. Sarah, what do you think about this target? He asked, pointing to a communications relay they needed to capture. Sarah studied the map and the intelligence reports they had been given. The red team knows we're moving clockwise around the training area. They'll expect us to hit this target next. What if we skip it temporarily and go for the third objective instead? That's risky, warned Stevens, another recruit. If we get bogged down at the third objective, we might not have time to come back for this one. But if we stick to the obvious sequence, the red team will have time to set up ambushes at each location, Sarah countered. Sometimes the biggest risk is doing what everyone expects you to do. Jackson nodded slowly. It's called the indirect approach. Keep the enemy guessing about your intentions. Rodriguez grinned. I like it. Plus, the third objective is in that forest area, where our smaller team size actually gives us an advantage. This time, Martinez didn't object. All right, we'll try Sarah's approach. But if this goes wrong, we're all going down together. The decision proved to be brilliant. While the red team had indeed prepared defensive positions around the second objective, they left the third objective lightly defended, expecting it to be hit last. The blue team was able to capture it quickly and quietly, then use their knowledge of the red team's positions to approach the second objective from an unexpected direction. By the time the 24-hour exercise ended, the blue team had successfully completed all 3 objectives, while preventing the red team from completing any of theirs. Sarah found herself exhausted but exhilarated. Not just from the victory, but from the way the team had come together and adapted under pressure. During the debrief session, Sergeant Miller addressed both teams. This exercise teaches us several important lessons. First, no plan survives contact with the enemy. You have to be ready to adapt. Second, leadership isn't about rank or seniority, it's about making good decisions under pressure. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. Martinez, you started as blue team leader. What happened out there? Martinez stood up straight. I made a tactical error, Sergeant. My initial plan was flawed, and when it started to fall apart, I wasn't flexible enough to adapt. Sarah identified the problems and provided better solutions. In a real combat situation, following a bad plan because of ego would get people killed. And what did you learn from that? That good leadership sometimes means recognizing when someone else has a better idea and being willing to follow it. Sergeant Miller nodded approvingly, then turned to Sarah. Martinez, what did you learn about leadership during this exercise? And that it's not about being in charge, Sergeant. It's about making sure the mission succeeds and everyone makes it home safely. Sometimes that means leading from the front. Sometimes it means supporting someone else's good decisions. And sometimes it means making unpopular choices because they're tactically sound. Outstanding answer. Now, here's what I observed during this exercise. Sergeant Miller pulled out his notes and addressed the entire group. Martinez showed excellent technical skills and initial planning ability. When his plan encountered problems, he struggled to adapt, but he showed good character by recognizing his mistakes. Sarah demonstrated superior tactical thinking, terrain analysis, and flexible leadership. She didn't try to take over. She offered solutions and let the team decide how to use them. He paused to let that sink in. In 12 weeks of training, I've seen big, strong recruits who couldn't handle mental pressure, and small, smart recruits who couldn't handle physical demands. The ones who succeed in special forces are the ones who combine mental toughness with physical capability, and the wisdom to know when to lead and when to follow. That evening, as the recruits cleaned their gear and prepared for the next day's challenges, Thompson approached Sarah in the equipment bay. "I need to tell you something," he said, looking uncomfortable. "Before I came here, I was against women in combat roles. I thought it would make units weaker, more complicated. I was wrong." Sarah continued cleaning her rifle while he spoke. "What changed your mind?" "Watching you operate. You don't make things more complicated. You solve problems other people don't even see. You don't make the unit weaker. You make it smarter." Thompson paused. "I wanted to apologize for the assumptions I made, and to say that if I ever find myself in a real combat situation, I'd be honored to serve alongside you." Sarah looked up from her work. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." As Thompson walked away, Rodriguez appeared with his cleaning kit. "You know what the best part of today was?" he asked. "What's that?" Watching Martinez realize that leadership isn't about being the biggest or loudest person in the room. Some of the best military leaders in history were people who others underestimated at first. Sarah smiled. "My grandfather used to say that the most dangerous person in any fight is the one everyone thinks can't win. Not because they're secretly stronger, but because they've had to get smarter and tougher to survive being underestimated." As she finished cleaning her weapon, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first day when Sergeant Miller had looked at her with doubt. The doubt was gone now, replaced by something much more valuable. Respect earned through performance under pressure. But even as she felt proud of what she had accomplished, Sarah knew that the hardest tests were still ahead. The next phase of training would push every recruit to their absolute limits. And she would need every lesson she had learned about leadership, strategy, and perseverance to make it through. The final 3 weeks of training arrived with the weight of everything Sarah had worked toward hanging in the balance. Of the original 50 recruits who had stepped off that bus 12 weeks ago, only 18 remained. Each one had proven themselves capable of handling the physical and mental demands of Special Forces training, but now came the ultimate test. A simulation so realistic and demanding that even experienced soldiers sometimes failed to complete it. Sergeant Miller gathered the remaining candidates in a briefing room they had never seen before. The walls were covered with satellite photographs, intelligence reports, and tactical diagrams. At the front of the room stood Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the entire Special Forces training program. "Congratulations on making it this far," Colonel Harrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat. "What you've accomplished already puts you in the top 5% of military personnel. But this final exercise will determine whether you have what it takes to wear the green beret." She gestured to the maps behind her. "You will be divided into 3 teams of 6. Each team has been assigned a high-value target in hostile territory. You have 72 hours to infiltrate, gather intelligence, neutralize the threat, and extract without being captured by opposing forces." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was what she had been training for. A real-world simulation that would test every skill they had learned. The opposing forces are comprised of active duty Rangers and Marines who have volunteered to play the role of enemy combatants. They know you're coming. They know roughly when you're coming, and their job is to stop you by any means necessary. If you're captured, you'll face interrogation scenarios designed to test your resistance training. Colonel Harrison's expression grew even more serious. "This is not a game. The stress, fatigue, and pressure you'll experience will be as close to actual combat as we can make it without using live ammunition. Some of you will not complete this exercise. That doesn't mean you've failed as soldiers. It means Special Forces isn't your calling." Sarah found herself assigned to Team Alpha, along with Jackson, Rodriguez, Chen, Stevens, and Morrison, a quiet recruit from Montana who had consistently performed well in marksmanship and reconnaissance training. As they gathered their equipment and studied their mission briefing, Sarah realized that her teammates were looking to her for leadership. "What do you think, Sarah?" Jackson asked, as they reviewed satellite photos of their target area. "How do we approach this?" The target was a fortified compound in mountainous terrain, approximately 15 miles from their insertion point. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target would be present at the compound for a 12-hour window, giving them a narrow opportunity to complete their mission. Sarah studied the terrain carefully. The most direct route to the compound was through a valley that offered good concealment, but would also be the most obvious approach for any attacking force. Alternative routes existed, but they required traversing difficult mountain terrain that would slow their progress significantly. "The enemy forces will expect us to either take the direct route through the valley or attempt to approach from the high ground," Sarah said, tracing potential paths on the map. "But look at this." She pointed to a series of ridges that ran parallel to the valley but were separated from it by a deep gorge. "If we can cross this gorge here, we can move along these ridges without being visible from the valley floor or the compound. It's more dangerous, but it's also completely unexpected." Rodriguez studied the topographical map. "That gorge is almost 200 feet deep. How do we get across?" "Rope bridge," Morrison said quietly. He rarely spoke during planning sessions, but when he did, it was usually worth hearing. "I've done technical rescue work back home. If we can get a line across, we can rig a crossing that will support our weight and equipment." Stevens looked skeptical. "That sounds incredibly risky. If something goes wrong, we're stuck on the wrong side of a gorge with no way to reach our objective." "All our options are risky," Sarah replied. "The question is, which risk gives us the best chance of mission success while keeping the team safe?" Chen had been studying the timing requirements. "If we take the gorge route, we'll need to move faster once we're across. The longer approach means less time for reconnaissance and planning the actual assault. That's where our previous training pays off," Jackson said. "We've practiced rapid target assessment and flexible mission planning. We can adapt once we get eyes on the objective." The team spent 2 more hours refining their plan, working through contingencies and emergency procedures. Sarah found herself naturally coordinating the discussion, drawing input from each team member and synthesizing their expertise into a coherent strategy. As they prepared to move out, Sergeant Miller approached their position. "Team Alpha, let me see your approach plan." Sarah briefed their strategy while the rest of the team made final equipment checks. Sergeant Miller listened without comment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing or contingency plans. "Interesting approach," he said when Sarah finished. "You realize that if you can't cross that gorge, your entire mission fails before you even get close to the objective?" "Yes, Sergeant. But we also realize that taking a predictable route almost guarantees we'll be detected and engaged before we can complete the mission. Sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe." Sergeant Miller nodded slowly. "Remember, Team Alpha, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Stay flexible out there." The insertion was scheduled for 0200 hours. Team Alpha would be dropped 5 miles from their planned crossing point, requiring them to navigate through difficult terrain in complete darkness. As they loaded into the helicopter, Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission focus that had become second nature over the past 12 weeks. The flight to the insertion point was conducted in complete radio silence. Sarah used the time to run through the mission plan once more, visualizing each phase and thinking through potential problems. Beside her, her teammates were doing the same. Final mental preparation for what could be the most challenging 72 hours of their military careers. When the helicopter touched down, Team Alpha moved quickly into the darkness, using night vision equipment and careful terrain navigation to make their way toward the gorge crossing point. The terrain was even more difficult than the maps had indicated, with loose rock, thick vegetation, and steep slopes that required careful movement to avoid making noise. 3 hours into the mission, they reached the gorge crossing point. Morrison immediately began assessing the technical challenges, while the rest of the team established security and prepared their equipment. Good news and bad news. Morrison reported quietly. Good news is that there's a sturdy tree on this side that can serve as an anchor point. Bad news is that the closest anchor point on the far side is about 30 feet further than our maps showed. Sarah moved up to assess the situation herself. In the green glow of her night vision equipment, the gorge looked even more intimidating than she had expected. The crossing would require absolute precision and teamwork. Can we make it work? She asked Morrison. He nodded grimly. We'll need to use almost all our rope, and the crossing angle will be steeper than ideal. But it's doable if we're careful. What's the risk assessment? Morrison considered carefully before answering. If our rigging fails, whoever is crossing at the time falls 200 feet onto rocks. If we do everything right, we all get across safely, but we'll be committed to this route with no way back. Sarah looked at each of her teammates. They had trained together, fought together, and trusted each other with their lives. Now that trust would be tested in the most literal way possible. We knew this was the high-risk option when we chose it, she said quietly. Everyone still on board? 5 nods in the darkness confirmed their commitment. Morrison spent 45 minutes rigging the rope bridge, double and triple checking every knot and anchor point. When he finished, he would be the first to cross, testing the system under the weight of a fully equipped soldier. See you on the other side, he whispered, then disappeared into the darkness above the gorge. The crossing took 20 minutes. Each team member had to move carefully along the rope, fighting against the natural tendency to hurry when suspended above such a dangerous drop. Sarah went last, partially to ensure everyone else made it safely, and partially because she knew that if anything went wrong during her crossing, the mission could continue without her. As her feet touched solid ground on the far side of the gorge, Sarah felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. They had successfully completed the most dangerous part of their mission, and now they were positioned where no enemy force would expect to find them. The approach to the compound took another 4 hours of careful movement through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight and was brutal in the darkness. But Sarah's team had learned to move as a unit, communicating through hand signals and covering each other's movement with practiced efficiency. When they finally reached their observation position overlooking the target compound, Sarah realized that all their training had led to this moment. She was lying in the darkness, planning an assault on a fortified position, with 5 soldiers who trusted her judgment completely. Through her scope, she could see sentries moving around the compound perimeter. Guard positions were exactly where the intelligence briefing had predicted. But Sarah noticed something the satellite photos had missed. A patrol pattern that created a brief gap in coverage every 18 minutes. Rodriguez, you see that dead zone by the north wall? She whispered into her radio. Copy. 18-minute intervals. Chen, Morrison, what do you see on the south approach? Their reconnaissance continued for 2 hours, with each team member contributing observations that built a complete picture of the target's defenses. Sarah found herself coordinating their information naturally, seeing patterns and opportunities that emerged from combining everyone's input. When they finally moved to assault the compound, everything happened with the precision of a perfectly choreographed dance. Rodriguez and Chen eliminated the sentries silently. Jackson and Stevens secured the perimeter. Morrison provided overwatch. Sarah led the infiltration of the main building. Inside, they found their target, a mannequin representing a high-value enemy leader, surrounded by intelligence documents they needed to photograph and enemy communications equipment they needed to sabotage. As Sarah coordinated the intelligence gathering, she heard Jackson's voice in her earpiece. Contact. Enemy patrol approaching from the east. 2 minutes out. This was the moment that would define their mission's success. They could grab what they could and extract immediately, completing a partial mission, or they could stay and finish the job properly while risking capture or engagement with superior enemy forces. How much more time do you need? Sarah asked Chen, who was photographing documents. 90 seconds to get everything. Morrison. Status on the communications equipment. 30 seconds to complete sabotage. Sarah made the decision that would determine whether they returned as successful Special Forces candidates or as failures who had gotten too aggressive and compromised their mission. We finished the job. Jackson, Stevens, can you delay that patrol for 2 minutes? Consider it done, Jackson replied. The next 2 minutes felt like hours, But Team Alpha completed their mission objectives and extracted successfully, using their knowledge of the terrain to disappear into the mountains before the enemy forces could organize an effective pursuit. 72 hours later, as Sarah stood with her 5 teammates in front of Colonel Harrison, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From that first day when Sergeant Miller had looked at her with doubt, through the physical challenges, tactical exercises, leadership tests, and finally this ultimate trial, she had proven that determination and intelligence could overcome any assumptions about what she could or couldn't accomplish. Team Alpha, Colonel Harrison announced. Mission success. Intelligence objectives completed. Target neutralized. All personnel extracted safely. This represents one of the finest performances in this exercise that I have witnessed in 15 years of running this program. She paused, looking directly at Sarah. Martinez, your leadership during this exercise was exemplary. You made difficult decisions under pressure, adapted to unexpected challenges, and brought your entire team home safely while completing all mission objectives. As Colonel Harrison continued her debrief, Sarah felt the weight of what she had accomplished settling over her. She had not only proven herself worthy of wearing the green beret, she had earned the respect and trust of soldiers who would serve alongside her in the most dangerous missions their country might ask them to undertake. The ceremony where they received their green berets was simple but profound. As Sarah felt the weight of the beret being placed on her head, she thought about everyone who had doubted whether someone like her belonged in special forces. More importantly, she thought about all the young women who might see her success and realize that their own dreams of military service were achievable. Sergeant Miller approached her after the ceremony. Martinez, I owe you an apology. When you stepped off that bus 12 weeks ago, I looked at you and saw someone who might not have what it takes. I was wrong, Sarah smiled. You weren't wrong to have doubts. Sergeant, you were wrong to let those doubts become assumptions. There's a difference. What's next for you, Martinez? Sarah looked around at her teammates, at the other newly minted Special Forces soldiers, at the facility where she had proven herself against every challenge they could devise. Whatever mission needs doing, Sergeant. Whatever mission needs doing. As she walked away from the ceremony, Sarah realized that her journey wasn't ending. It was just beginning. She had proven that she belonged among the elite soldiers of Special Forces. But more importantly, she had learned that the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from refusing to be defeated by their expectations. The assumptions people made about her based on her size, her gender, or their own preconceptions had become her greatest source of strength. Every doubt had made her train harder, think smarter, and perform better. Every challenge had taught her something new about leadership, teamwork, and perseverance. And now, as she prepared to serve her country in the most demanding military role available, Sarah Martinez carried with her the knowledge that no obstacle is insurmountable for someone who refuses to accept limitations imposed by others, and who never stops working to prove that character, intelligence, and determination matter more than any physical characteristic. The young woman who had been underestimated by everyone was now ready to serve alongside the best soldiers in the world. Not despite her differences, but because those differences had made her stronger than anyone had imagined possible.